Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today we're going to be going on to our next position in our 2025 Summer Scouting Series, as we're going to be looking at what is actually a pretty talented tight end class. It's a big change from last year, talking about the depth of this class. There's probably even more players that won't be mentioned in this video, but I'll be honest, every person on this list that I mentioned, I think could have a legit big role in the NFL. Not all starters necessarily, but guys that would be contributors in the NFL. So it's a lot different from last year, where you really just had a few names and some guys that, maybe were a little overhyped, and that's just what happens when you don't have a lot of prospects in the class. But it's a good one this year, so really excited to get into that. We've got 8 prospects we're going to talk about. We got some really good talent at the top 2. We've got 2 guys specifically I've got as first rounders, and our third guy will be an interesting one because he's not ranked super high, but someone that I really like and I think could be a gem, and I think he's going to a fantastic situation in 2024 to boost up that stock from, what could be a middle of day 3 guy to really an early day 2 person. So really excited to share who that is, but we're going to jump into this at the bottom of my list with someone who still, for being on the bottom of my list, has some impressive traits. And that's Caden Prieskorn. I'm probably saying last name wrong. It's going to happen every single video. There's no way around it. Prieskorn is a pretty big tight end. He's 6'5", 255, pretty ideal size. Wonder maybe if the arm length isn't more than average. That's the only thing I really noticed, but pretty good size overall. This guy, the thing that stands out about him is his incredible catching ability. He has some really impressive moments. That's definitely where his strength is in his game, and that's what really, I think, lets me know that there's a possibility he could be a starter in the NFL, because everything else, like as far as what he is as a receiver, there's some questions, right? I mean, you see that through the grades. We have the athleticism and the route running at a D+ and a C+, but the catching is so good with him that I think he could still succeed even if he's not a huge separation guy. So with that said, I'm going to jump into my notes on him. Positives that I wrote with him, I mentioned the catching, right? Consistently good catcher with wild moments. He has mostly ideal size for a tight end. This is a powerful guy in the open field. He's not necessarily just laying the hammer down all the time, but it's not easy to bring him down. He is a tough guy, and that's going to help him with that tough coverage. It's going to help him with close coverage. It's going to help him with his blocking, which, yeah, his blocking still needs a little bit of work. It's kind of average at this point. It's helped a lot by his size, but that gives him upside in that regard, and that could be a place where he improves this year. His top speed as well, it's not impressive or like elite necessarily. It's not that bad. It kind of makes up for that lack of athleticism in general, and so I think there's a little bit of something there to where he could survive as a receiver, doing that role as a tight end. Now, there's concerns with Caden. Now, first one, he is the oldest prospect in this class potentially. I'm sure there's probably like one guy out there that'll be a UDFA. It's maybe like 27, but this is the oldest guy I've ever scouted. 25, gonna turn 26 at the start of his rookie season. That's crazy stuff there. He'd be turning 30 on his second contract, like literally the first week of the season. Other things with him, like I mentioned, not that impressive of an athlete. He kind of lumbers around when he's moving in the open field. He's also someone who might not have ideal arm length, but I didn't really notice too awfully much there. It might just be something where he's okay. And then there's some plays where he just doesn't seem like he's going 100% routes. Now, I know some of that is just him trying to vary his routes, but there's times where I just don't really understand why we're seeing that. So that could be something where it's not as big of an issue as I mentioned, but I kind of wonder why that's the case. Another thing as well, I just don't know if he's going to be a separator. I don't think he's going to be that. He's too slow most of the time. He gets blanketed. But one thing that I will say with him that is impressive, and I forgot to mention this in the positives, and this really makes up for that lack of route running, he knows where to get open. He knows where to sit in zone coverage. He will get to the right spot. He will give you a throwing window, and he'll make the damn catch. He will make it pretty much every single time. So that's good, and that makes up for it. So he has these traits that keep him from being limited to maybe a backup. But, at the same time, not a ton of upside here. He's got room to grow for sure in a lot of different ways, but he does have some nice traits to work with. And it's just a question of how much more you can teach a guy who's 25, going into his final season in college. Now, my summary for him, I wrote that he's a big tight end with some exciting traits that could carve out a respectable career. He's an impressive hands catcher with a low drop rate and some highlight reel moments. He isn't a great athlete, but his game revolves around strength, being able to hold up as a blocker, and fight through defenders as a receiving threat. A final impressive trait of his is his ability to get open in zone coverage. If he's not directly covered, he finds the open area and consistently creates a big throwing window for a quarterback, a trait that makes me confident in his ability to play in the pros. On the flip side, he might be the oldest prospect in this class, turning 26 years old at the start of his rookie year. As mentioned before, I question his overall athleticism and often find him blanketed in man coverage. Finally, while he's a strong player, he doesn't sustain blocks consistently and can get lost too often. While he's probably not going to enter the upper echelon of tight ends at the next level, he has the skills to carve out a role for a long time in the NFL. So my grade for him, I gave him a C, middle of the third round. That might be a bit generous given his age. I know I usually put older prospects a little bit lower, but my pro comp for him was Jake Ferguson. The reason why I gave this, first of all, Ferguson's a little bit of an upside projection because he's been very successful in the NFL. He's outperformed what was expected of him. But the guys have very similar games. They're both guys that they weren't really impressive athletes or blockers, but they thrived on an ability to find open areas and be reliable catchers. And another thing with them, neither of them were super impressive after the catch, but they do have some upside there. Talking about the physicality that Caden can have in his game. Now, as far as film watch, this was all 2023. Some of these guys it wasn't, but Prieskorn was one of them. I watched Alabama, Georgia, and Penn State. So that's our first guy here. And we've got some other fun names to talk about, and it just gets more fun as we go through. But our seventh guy here, and the second one we'll talk about, is an Iowa tight end, and Luke Lachey. And with Luke Lachey, there is a ton of hype because everyone's thinking about Sam Laporta, right? Everyone's thinking about all the other tight ends to come out, the TJ Hawkinsons, I think even like George Kittle. You've got a lot of good names that have come out of Iowa. And so anytime there's someone who's a legit tight end out of that school, they're probably going to be great in the pros. My question with Lachey is whether or not he's in that group, because you go through the history of Iowa tight ends drafted, you got a lot of hits, right? But you also got guys that, weren't incredible at the program and then didn't really do anything in the NFL. And so the question for me is, which one is he? Or is he just an outlier? Because you can't really helmet scout too awfully much, but I will at least say if we see an Iowa tight end who's productive, you got to take notice of it because it'll probably end up turning out better. But getting into Luke Lachey, he's going to turn 24 a little bit after the draft. He's a tall guy, 6'6", 253. He's got a massive frame with long arms. And he's built for being a receiving tight end. He's a guy with really great acceleration off the line, and he has good hands. He's very few drops throughout his career. Well, I wouldn't say he's a strong asset as a blocker. He is someone who fights hard, and he will fight to the death as a blocker. Another thing, final positive I wrote with him was that he fights through contact on routes. He's not afraid of contact. He can get physical with people. It's something you really like to see, especially out of a receiving threat. Now, of course, there are concerns with this game. He is an older prospect with a recent season-ending injury. So that is one of the first things to note. In addition to that, he seems to potentially be a high-waisted prospect. That might be one of the reasons why his agility is a little limited. why I didn't give him an A in his athletic score. He's also someone who, when he's blocking, he's losing defenders too easily. There's questions about his ability to sustain it. As well as a route runner, especially when he's making cuts, he gets kind of stuck in the mud when changing directions. He's not really a guy who has a whole lot of suddenness to his game. And the final thing I wrote as a concern for Luke Lachey is that there's some questions about his top speed. There were plays where he could get down the seam, he could get open, and there would be no one up above him, but he just wouldn't really have the speed to break away. So, I mean, I know he's a tight end. You're not going to have many guys who are going to go burn the field, although we do have one in here that we'll talk about who's a very interesting prospect. But yeah, for Lachey, he's definitely not someone who's going to take the top off the defense and run down the field for the touchdown. So those are my notes on him. My summary for him, I said he's a long athletic tight end with a lot of hype due to recent tight ends from Iowa like Laporta, Hawkinson, and Kittle. He has a balanced build, great acceleration off the line, and immense physicality when faced against defenders. Lachey is a strong catcher, consistently bringing down passes with few drops. While I wouldn't say he's a plus blocker, Lachey fights to the death when tasked with such a job. Unfortunately, I have some questions that need to be answered before I see Lachey as the next great Iowa tight end. With his age and a major injury last season, he needs to produce to prove he's back as he was before. In addition, he needs to develop as a route runner as he struggles to glide through cuts and create consistent separation and man coverage. Lachey could go anywhere after the first round depending on this season, and I really believe that because if he's not the next great Iowa tight end, he's gonna go day 3, right? If he's good this year and he starts to warrant all that hype that he's getting, you could see something as crazy as him going late first round. I wouldn't do that, but I think he could go in that Sam Laporta range. It's definitely potential to happen. Now, my pro comp for him, and I have him as an early third right now. I ended up going with Luke Schoonmaker, so we got another Luke here. Both prospects, just comparing them, they were older athletic tight ends that excelled with their speed coming out of college. Both guys who struggled, though, with stiffness athletically, and they weren't able to really flex well through cuts, and they kind of got bogged down when changing directions. And then another thing as far as run blocking, while they were both fighters, they both just kind of lacked the ideal power to succeed in that facet, and that's why Luke Lachey gets a poor grade there. But he's an early third-round guy for me right now. I watched a lot of 2022 film for him, which is part of the reason why I heavily hit at him needing to prove it this year, because it's been a little bit since we've seen a whole season. But I watched Michigan in 2022, Ohio State in 2022, and Iowa State in 2023. So now, moving forward, we're going to get to a Clemson tight end here. We're going to talk about Jake Briningstool. Now, he's someone that I've heard of as a sleeper in this class, specifically from Hack City. They've been pretty big on him, and that's a fun show. If you want to learn anything about college prospects and have fun with it and hear banter, that's where you got to go, right? But this is a guy that has a little bit of hype in that way, and you can see the potential here, but he's very much a player who still needs to prove he's worth the hype and the potential. He's someone that has good overall length, but obviously is pretty undersized as I mute my ESPN notification. He's 230. This is roughly 20 pounds under what I'd expect from an average tight end. So a long guy that doesn't have his frame filled out too awfully well, but he plays a little more traditional than maybe some of the other guys we'll talk about. So that is somewhere that I think is very interesting in his game. But good overall length. As a blocker, even being 230, he brings effort, and he is much better than you would expect in that regard, and I almost gave him an average grade because of it. So if he adds on a little bit of size, I think he could absolutely be a positive in run blocking. He has good athleticism. He moves quick on his routes. He's very fast. He has a good level of physicality, especially for his size. And he's a reliable player in most aspects of the game, especially as a receiving threat. Final positive I wrote with him, he has consistently good hands. Not elite. They are good hands, though. There's some guys in this class that you just got to give him better grades because you see some wow plays that you just usually aren't going to bring down. Now, concerns for Briningstool, I had that he needs to add more size to his frame if he's tasked with blocking duties. They got to make the decision whether he's going to be your like modern receiving tight end that's really just a slot receiver, in which he's going to have to take some different snaps next year because he played a lot more in line, wasn't kicking out to like out wide like you might see from an Evan Ingram. So his role might change if he's going to do that, or he needs to figure out if maybe he adds on just a little more size, like 235, 240, and he plays more traditional. He gets into more blocking situations. I think he could go either way. He's probably a traditional guy, though, if I had to take my guess. Other things with him, scramble drills, he could do a little bit more. This was a minor thing, maybe kind of a non-factor. And he also needs to get a better feel for where to sit in zone coverage. So he can do a little bit better helping out the quarterback with his route running and decision-making deep into routes. Now, getting into my summary for him, another early third-round guy, right? He's a reliable receiving tight end who brings effort in all facets of the game. He has good length and plays to a level of physicality above what his usual size usually offers. Briningstool has consistently reliable hands, bringing down most of his passes and having few drops. There's a lot of untapped potential here, but Briningstool will need to grow in some areas to warrant an early selection. Probably looking at, I'd say, like early round 2 as that early selection. He's quite undersized as a traditional tight end and will have to decide what style of player he wants to be. Whether a more traditional build he shows flashes of, or a pure receiving threat. Briningstool can also improve his understanding of where to sit in zone coverage, as he often doesn't leave much of a throwing window. He'll be a player to watch in the tight end class this season as a potential riser. So my comp for him, I went with a Jacksonville guy here. Is in KC now, to be fair, but he was in Jacksonville for a time, and that's Garrett Prince. Now, my comp here for him was because both these prospects, looking at their builds, these are tall, athletic tight ends. Guys that played more of a traditional role, though, didn't really go full on into just the receiving threat because they gave really good effort as blockers. There were also prospects that showed good hands late in their college careers. I know Prince was one that had a lot of drops earlier on when I was researching him, but ended his career well. And these are guys who had good route running skills as well before the catch. So, questions, of course, with Briningstool, like late in routes, perhaps, but I think other than that, he's relatively strong in that aspect and gets a good grade. Now, my film watched here, this was all 2023. I watched Duke, Florida State, and Kentucky. So, talking about prospects that haven't played a lot recently, this was one that I did not understand why he was really being talked about as a top tight end, and that's Brant Kuithe. So Brant Kuithe has not really played football since early 2022. It has been a while, but there's reason why he's getting talked about here. What turns you off immediately is you look at his size, right? 6'2", 236. You're like, this guy is not a tight end. But when you watch him play, there's something special to his game. He is an explosive mover. He glides around the field. He's a unicorn. You almost have to look at him as more of an offensive weapon that just happens to be playing tight end, which you don't have many tight ends you really call that. He's a great separator. He's a major threat as a route runner. And if he's in space, it's like you're going up against like Tank Dell almost. Obviously extreme comparison, but you kind of get the point I'm trying to get at. He also looks like he's in a street fight when he's blocking. He will beat the crap out of guys. Like it's a fight to the death when he gets involved there. He also seems to have adequate arm length despite being undersized. So that's definitely something you like to see. And he's an experienced and effective lead blocker when he's on the move. Final thing I noticed with him was that he's a tough player, and that kind of goes back to that blocking, how he fights through contact. He's a really fun guy to watch. Now getting into some of the concerns with him, because there are obviously concerns. He's a 25-year-old heading into the draft, 6'2" tight end that's undersized. He is the second oldest prospect probably out of everyone I'm going to scout. And we'll see, of course, maybe we get a Kyrie Jackson that, takes care of the job and he's older or something. But these guys are old prospects. It's been a long time as well since we've seen Kuithe play. So if Kuithe goes out and doesn't play great, then all of a sudden that draft stock might go down pretty quick. So there's a big question there. We got to see this season because he's got a lot to prove. He's obviously very undersized. He comes in under basically every average threshold by far. And as a blocker, while I said he looks like he's in a street fight, he more so harasses people than dominates them. He doesn't really have the strength to dominate guys, but he's going to put in the work. I think he can be used as a blocker. And the final thing, and this seems to be kind of a common issue with some of these faster guys, whether tight end or at a wide receiver, inconsistent hands. Few too many drops on his film. If he can improve that, he could be a complete offensive weapon. But there's a lot of upside here with this game. For my summary, I said Kuithe is a special player and a very rare film evaluation. The immediate thoughts shift towards concerns over being extremely undersized and having missed football for nearly 2 years, but there's a reason why he's on everyone's radar early. Kuithe is a fantastic athlete, exploding out of his stance and creating separation with his elite route running skills. While undersized, he brings an obvious physical element to his game, getting in the street fights with defenders. Kuithe is used in many ways, but there's little doubt he can project as a strong offensive weapon. The closest comparison I can think of for Kuithe is his former teammate, mainly because of how they were used and where they thrive since size is a major difference. The ultimate question for me is what Kuithe's role is for an offense. Is he an ideal starting tight end or a heavy usage offensive weapon? I'd lean towards the latter, and unfortunately, there's a ceiling for where you take those players. Kuithe has something to prove this year after being off the grid for a couple of seasons, though if he can get back to his old form, someone will take a shot on him early. So going back to that comp, it is a very loose comp. This is probably the loosest comp I've used, right? Because Dalton Kincaid is a much larger player, and really it just comes down to the usage. These guys were on the same offense together. They did the same things, right? So talking about that usage, they're both guys who primarily seen as receivers, right? Had exceptional athleticism. Route running was great. It helped them produce guys that were physical after the catch as well. They weren't great blockers, but guys who fought hard in the trenches. So that's about as far as that comp goes. It's a very loose one, but I'm just listing one for everyone, and this is going to be probably the weakest of them. Now, going to film, we had some 2021 film, so we were going back to that Devin Lloyd team there. But I went with UCLA from 2021, Oregon from that same season, and then Florida from 2022. So those were the games I ended up watching for Kuithe. Now, we're getting into the top half now, getting into our next guy, North Carolina tight end Bryson Nesbit. So this was a guy that at first I wasn't really high on. A lot of the time when I see players that aren't traditional, I end up getting kind of low on them at first, unless they can convince me that they're just going to be special. And Nesbit, I don't know if he's convinced me he's going to be special, but he reminds me a lot of Evan Ingram and the way he plays the game. And that's an upside comp. That's not saying this is Evan Ingram 2.0. But there's that potential there, and he could end up being a big riser in this class because of that. But getting into my notes, this is a guy with great overall speed. He's almost like a receiver. It's really what he is. He has a low drop rate, really good hands, and has some juice. He switches things up with his releases as a route runner. It really looks like a wide receiver at times. At first, I was wondering if this was someone who just needed to move outside and play as an X receiver, but it's not really something he's familiar with, right? So big question there. But other positives, he has the speed through routes to catch defenders off guard. If they're expecting someone to run like a tight end, they're not going to get that guy coming up. They're going to get the guy running like a wide receiver. And that's going to lead to some mismatches. He's also a guy that isn't really a pushover as a blocker, despite his size, which I almost thought he wasn't even 235. He might be smaller than that. So, impressive stuff for how he plays the game at that size, but of course it comes with concerns and really pigeonholes him as a modern receiving tight end. He's very underweight to be used as a blocking tight end. That's not a role you want to see him in. That's not something he did very often. He was almost off the field completely on clear running situations. He also appears to maybe have average arm length. And his effort as a blocker, well, it's great. The results are poor. I almost had to give him an F there because he just doesn't have the strength to hold up there no matter how hard he fights. And not really as much of a concern as just a point, but he's a tight end in name only. Same as what Evan Ingram is, right? It says tight end. He is a slot receiver who kicks outside a little bit. And that's what Bryson Nesbit does. He is almost never used as an inline blocker. So very little experience there. My summary for him, I said that he looks the part of the next undercover slot receiver playing tight end. He's a great athlete at tight end, getting to his top speed quickly and gliding through cuts. Nesbit has good hands, having few drops over his career, given his volume in the receiving game. Defenders will likely view him as a receiving threat primarily, as he's mainly a beefed up slot receiver. He has major concerns if you want a traditional tight end, being severely underweight to dominate as a blocker, plus he wasn't used that often in that role. He was a confusing evaluation, but when you see him as a modern receiving tight end, it's easy to understand how he could succeed in the NFL. So, going back to the comp here, upside is Evan Ingram. I think that's the ceiling for him, which is a hell of a ceiling if you've been watching Evan Ingram recently, and most of you guys have because you're Jaguars fans. But like I said, upside comp, these guys have identical metrics, styles of play, similar size, right? Slim, built for the receiving game, and both of them flash dominant hands at times. Now, Ingram, as much as there were jokes about drop issues, he has become dominant in that area on the field. And so Nesbit's got a little bit of a ways to go there. But other things with these guys, they both struggle as blockers, but clear effort. They can be used in that role if they have to be. It's just not ideal. And for Nesbit to really reach this comp, it's going to require him to increase his volume, become a bigger part of that offense, and become more of a physical threat after the catch. That was probably the biggest difference. Is that Ingram he runs mad after the catch. You can see it on film. He's blowing through people. Nesbit has moments like that, but that's not what he always is. It's not really what he is. Now, I have Nesbit as a late second, and if he can reach that ceiling, and prove that he could be that guy in the NFL, then you probably take him early second to late first. I think that's very much in the cards. Now, film reviewed here. I went with South Carolina, Minnesota, and Clemson, all from the 2023 college football season. Now, we're not going to get into my top prospect, but we are going to get into my favorite guy, probably in this class. This is a guy that really impressed me, and I think he's being slept on a lot, just given where he's at in consensus. And of course, this is so early in the process that this could all flip by week 3 for all we know. But he's transferring to Georgia from Stanford, and damn, he looks like he's going to be a good player there. That's Benjamin Yurosek. Now, I've got a pretty big comp there. We'll talk about that in a minute, but he just impressed me. He's a guy with, he's not as tall as the other tight ends, but still I think has good size, good overall weight for what he is. He's 23. We're expecting. I wasn't able to get a specific age, but somewhere around there. I think this is his 5th year of college football. He's a good asset as a blocker. He gets the job done. Very good in that regard, actually. He got a B+ from me, which just kept going up as I watched him. He is tasked with a wide variety of assignments as well. He's proficient in all of them. He's a receiving tight end. He can block. He can get out as a lead blocker. He can even run the ball a little bit, go on jet sweeps and all that. He really does anything you'd ask of him at a pretty good level. He has phenomenal hands. He got an S from me there. He's a blue chip prospect in that regard specifically. He brings down pretty much every contested catch, no matter how difficult. He just feels like a guy that when he gets to the NFL, if you're throwing it to him, he's going to get it down. He's going to make the catch. He's going to get more targets because of that. He has the ceiling of being a high volume tight end. Now, final thing I wrote as a positive, I think he understands leverage pretty well as a route runner, just where to position himself and try to get open against defensive backs. But as far as concerns, doesn't have much suddenness as a route runner. He's not an incredible athlete. He's good still. Definitely has room to improve, though, as a route runner. He's also someone who can still up his blocking game, and he is coming off an injury from 2023 that limited his season. But if I'm betting on someone in this class to fly up the boards, Yurosek's that guy. There's something here with him. I wrote in my summary that he's a massive sleeper prospect in the upcoming draft class. He does everything at a high level, flashing dominance as a blocker and consistently winning in contested catch situations. Yurosek has done a wide variety of work in his college career, being used in traditional tight end roles, being a lead blocker, and even a rusher. When given targets, Yurosek dominates and becomes a reliable safety blanket for an offense. With this all said, he isn't perfect. He doesn't have a lot of suddenness as a route runner, and there are times when he screws up his blocks. He'll also be coming off an injury that sidelined him for half the season as he heads to a new school in Georgia. The general consensus, is sleeping on Yurosek, and I think we'll see him make a huge jump upwards as the season progresses. So, my lofty comp for him, and I want to make this clear that this does not mean he's going to duplicate the production from year one. That is a huge task to ask. You would be basically saying that Yurosek is tight end 1 in all of the NFL. I don't think that happens, but I think he could have that immediate impact with the team. Just being a reliable part of an offense. But my comp is Sam Laporta. These were guys that both of them were slightly undersized, that 6'4", 240s range, but they ended up having really complete games with an emphasis in their receiving capabilities. Both these prospects were good but not great athletes, and were underestimated as blockers by scouts and on the field as well. But both prospects showed, especially in Laporta's case, he proved this, that they can be high-volume targets in their careers with big games. You see some of those games from Yurosek. Laporta is obviously having them in the NFL. That upside is there. Differences, Yurosek is not as good of a route runner as what Sam Laporta is. That's going to be a big difference. But he might be a better blocker than Laporta. So I think he's got a great opportunity to become a better player. He's going to Georgia. He's taking over for Brock Bowers. He's going to be a high-volume guy, I think, in that offense. And he's someone that I'm keeping an eye on. You know, even as Jacksonville with Evan Ingram and Brendan Strange in the tight end room, I don't know what you got in Strange, right? But to get someone in that can do everything and hopefully do it all at a good level, that gives you a potential tight end of the future, and at bare minimum, you have a hell of a tight end too. I think it could be good value, and you could get him on the field a lot. So, huge fan of him. He got an early second from me, and he could go maybe as early as the late first round. So, love the film. I watched Arizona State from 2022. I watched Hawaii from 2023, and then Colorado from 2023. So now getting into the top two guys, everyone who has followed this class is going to know who they are already because they're pretty much the consensus top two at this point. The first one is Mitchell Evans. So Evans is more of your top blocking tight end, your top like big bodied guy. You know, he can still be a good threat in the receiving game. Nothing against him there, but he's very much that like all around, you know, can play inline tight end. He has great size. He's a huge frame that he's maxed out. He's not 6'6", but 6'5" is really good still. And he's 260 pounds. He's a good enough athlete to be a receiving threat. He plays well in that regard. He was a high volume guy. He's a solid blocker as well. He has room to grow there, but he's a solid guy. Uses head fakes on his routes. He tries to sell defenders, even if it's not always successful. And he understands how to gain leverage on those routes. He knows where to sit in his coverage, how to take advantage of zone. He has good agility for his size, and his hands are borderline elite. He makes some impressive grabs away from his frame and has the potential to probably end up having a blue chip grade in that regard. Now, concerns for him, he ended up tearing his ACL, I believe, in 2023. That's obviously going to be a problem. And hopefully he can fully recover and be ready to go this season and play at a high level. He's also a very upright blocker. He can get uprooted too easily. People get their hands into his chest and you can get him up pretty quick. He also, he tries to sell defenders on fakes. Kind of alluded to this. He doesn't have many sales. They don't always buy it because you kind of know what he's doing. He always fakes the same direction, then goes the opposite. So he's got to do a little bit better there. He's also not a guy with great top end speed. It's not what he's built for. Probably the most disappointing thing was the physicality was not what I was expecting. It was a little above average, but for his size, he could be a lot more there. And then final concern, not a huge threat after the catch. Didn't have a ton of yards after the catch. Maybe that changes this year. Could definitely see that, but that's an area where he can improve. My summary for Mitchell Evans, I said that he's a borderline prototypical big body tight end. He has great upside as both a blocker and a receiver. He has a huge frame. He's clearly having the size to be a successful blocker and dominate at the catch point. He lives up to this, bringing down insane throws, being a security blanket for an offense. He understands how to position himself on routes and find the weaknesses in zone coverage, making him a consistent target. While he doesn't have great athleticism, he has enough to get the job done. There are some concerns with him, though, as he'll be coming off a major injury from the previous season, and before going down last year, he still needed to improve his blocking technique and become a more consistent part of the offense. He should be a high floor prospect who can start for an NFL team, so this season should be all about whether or not he has the potential to be one of the premier players at his position in the NFL. So my comp, and this might be a low-end comp, but I went with Pat Freiermuth, he's been pretty good, but not necessarily the upper echelon, like top tight ends, right? He's not really in that group, but he's right below. This comp I used because both these guys, big-bodied tight ends, excelled as receivers primarily because of that route running skill. Both guys were reliable at the catch point, had moments of dominance in college. Difference, though, Evans is probably someone with a bit more upside as a blocker, but Freiermuth is maybe more of an athlete. So Evans leans more towards your traditional kind of inline tight end. So that's your major difference there. But Evans is a late first rounder to me. I gave him an A-. The film I watched for him, I went with NC State, Ohio State, and Duke, all from the 2023 season. So with that said, we're going to get into my top guy and someone who's going to be a really good first-round pick and probably a great tight end for fantasy football, by the way, for anyone out there who plays that. Colston Loveland, 21 years old, super young player heading into the draft. Turns 21, I think, right before the draft. He's 6'5", 245, really good size for a receiving threat. He has a very good overall frame, very good size, great explosion for a tight end. He's a great overall athlete, incredibly fluid, and when he's running downfield, he turns into a bowling ball after the catch. He's someone who has experience lining up out wide as well, so he can play a little bit more of that modern receiving role as a tight end. And while he's not a great blocker, he consistently gives effort. You can see that pay off at times. It shows upside there. You know, he could end up being someone who's good enough to go. He's also someone with smooth transitions through routes. He doesn't lose speed. He has a good understanding of how to create separation on long developing routes. He flashes a great upside as well as a catcher on his highlights. So a lot of things to like about Colston Loveland and not many to dislike. My concerns I wrote, I just said he has inconsistent results as a blocker. He doesn't really have the strength to hold up blocks against defensive linemen as well. So a little bit better maybe against corners and such, but defensive linemen's pretty bad for him, which that's normal, be fair. He has occasional drops as well that just should not happen. Some pretty bad ones in there. Not that there's a high volume of that, but just not good, you know. And then he's someone who still needs to learn where to sit down in coverage. He needs to improve that a little bit. So those are my concerns, but there's a lot of good things to say about him. My summary, I said he's a fantastic height, weight, speed combination at the tight end position. He's a great athlete with the fluidity to glide through cuts and create separation. He shows great upside at the catch point, making impressive grabs away from his frame. After the catch, Loveland turns into a bowling ball, putting his head down and rumbling through defenders. As a blocker, Loveland isn't proficient yet, but he shows great effort and the flashes of upside are there. While he enters his third year as a top prospect, he'll need to refine the blocking elements of his game. He struggles to hold off edge rushers, often losing early with poor angles on blocks. Against linebackers and defensive backs, results are inconsistent and need to be more reliable. Finally, Loveland must choose better areas to sit down in coverage, as he often stops near defenders, eliminating any chance of being a viable target. Seeing that Loveland is already a superbly talented prospect and one of the youngest in this class, it's hard to imagine he doesn't cement himself as a legitimate first-round pick. And I went with a pretty good player for this comp. I went with Mark Andrews. As far as the comparison between them, both were great height, weight, speed guys with impressive athletic ability, had upside as catchers and the fluidity to glide through cuts, create separation. Difference, though, where Andrews is better is that he was better at finding those soft spots in zone coverage. So this is a little bit of an upside comp, which is fair. You're using Mark Andrews here. And then I also said that both of them struggled as blockers, although I do think that Loveland has more urgency than Andrews did. So, Loveland is a borderline elite tight end prospect. He has a lot of upside, should be going in the first round. I have him as a middle of the first round guy right now. And really just comes down to, can he get to that next level this year? And I think he can. He's young, he's learning, and there's clearly improvement on the film. So what I watched for him to get that middle of the first round grade, I watched Penn State, Ohio State, and Alabama, all from the 2023 college football season. So with that said, that's what we've got for this video. Those are our 8 tight ends we're going to start out with. Sure, more guys will pop up. There's plenty of prospects in this class, but we're kind of just hidden guys that are generally consensus high in the rankings. That's going to leave some people out, of course, but we're trying to make sure that hopefully by the end of the season, I'm not eliminating as many names from here, because every year there's guys who just fall off a cliff. There's guys who don't declare, but we're trying to eliminate those who end up falling off a cliff. We've seen guys go from 5th overall in the class to 255th as recent as last year. So that's all I've got for you today, though. I hope you guys enjoy. Let me know your thoughts on the tight end class. Let me know your thoughts on Benjamin Yurosek if you watch him. I thought he was really exciting and probably be the guy I'd take a bet on in this class, given the value of the pick as well, and where he'll probably go. But appreciate it. Hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.